So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dan Osterweil, who's going to be talking about one story, one family, the courageous tale of the Orphans Father. Dan is a retired physician, like me, but he has a long career in academics and health industry in California. He's the former vice president and medical director of SCAN Health Plan. He's been a professor of medicine at UCLA. He's the emeritus editor of the Journal of the American Medical Directors Association, which he founded. And he's a member of the editorial board of Caring for the Ages. Dr. Osterweil also co-authored 2 editions of Medical Care in the Nursing Home. He was born in 1947 in Bleidorn, a refugee camp in the Ansbach district of Germany, where his father was the medical director, and that's the story that we're going to hear about today. He immigrated to Israel in 1951 with his family and lived in Rishon LeZion. Okay, where he graduated from high school, followed by military service in the IDF. He started his medical studies in Siena, Italy, and graduating later from the Technion in Haifa, Israel. And Dan, we're really looking forward to your conversation with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you all for making the time to come and listen to the story. I'll spend a few minutes giving you the background why I did it. That was kind of a long pregnancy. And the background of our family was that nobody spoke about anything, as many families in Israel after the Holocaust. And I knew that something was unique about my parents' activity during the war, but I always was very proud in my friends, Azriel's parents, who were partisans. You know, they fought the Germans, they bombed, you know, they were part of, you remember, anyone saw Defiance, the movie Defiance, with Daniel Craig? Which was a group of Jews that escaped the ghetto, I think, in Riga and in Belarus, and then stayed in the forest, about 1,000 of them, and they survived. So 2 of the parents of my friend were actually in that group, and I always was fascinated by that, and I did not hear similar stories at home. But as I grew up, I started seeing things, especially after my father's death in 1967. I saw a lot of people I didn't really know before who came to the funeral and kind of started talking. And when my father died, my mother started talking. And my mother started talking about that period. Sounded like she wanted to really emphasize that it was a very meaningful, even though very difficult, but very meaningful period of her time, you know, of her life. And that's how I got to start thinking that I need to do something to document that. And I started researching it. And in 1987, I'm getting a phone call from a cousin who lived in Connecticut and said, he was teaching at Yale, and said, Dan, did you see the history of the Holocaust that, you know, blocking now on his name, the historian, the British historian, Jewish historian wrote, not Lanzmann.
Shama.
Okay. Let's try this.
No. He wrote he's the guy who wrote the biography of Churchill. Sir, he was a lord. Look, Helen, you can check on Google. So, is that better? Is that better? Is that better? Is that better? Martin Gilbert, exactly. And that book had, you know, it was kind of thick book, and there was a little paragraph, maybe 5 lines, about Jews who did for themselves. And the story of my father was there. Oh, that's interesting. So I ran to UCLA and went to a library and looked at there were two references and started seeing the whole story of the safe houses in Budapest. And that's where my interest picked up to start researching it from the beginning. Anyone is familiar, I want to have a sense, because I don't want to repeat things that you know. You have any historic background of what happened in Eastern Europe 1939 to 1946? Okay, well, there are a lot of things that people say they know and later on, but I'll touch upon some of those things. But I want to emphasize that this is like one story. And I was inspired by, actually, son of a colleague of yours, Gary, Elliot Cosgrove, who is a rabbi at the Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, who in one of the sermons, either Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, said it's very important to think about how the next generation will remember the Holocaust. He said in the United States, there are about less than 100,000 people who survived that are still around. They won't be there a few years from now. And the question is how the kids should remember that period. It becomes very relevant in light of what happened in October in Israel. But the question is, are you going to remember how people were killed and how they were exterminated and how bad it was, or you're going to remember what they did? And I chose to describe what they did. So, by the way, the book, I didn't bring any because I didn't know whether you'll allow me, but it's available on Amazon. It's called Orphans Father. So what I'll do, I'll cover very broad brush, Europe 39, Germany invading Poland, mentioning the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement. Anyone knows about it? Because that's a very typical deceit that happened then, and it's happening around us too. Just keep your eyes open, because there are a lot of half-truths and other things that are described. That's the reason I'm mentioning it. The ghetto that started a year later. The story of my father's escape from the concentration camp, and the war around the time that they were in Budapest, which was before the Germans came in, and survival, and I'll touch upon each of those areas. One thing I would like to encourage you, stop me anytime. I'm used to talk to public, and I don't have a problem if you stop me in the middle, because I go by association anyway. So, as a backdrop, on the left is the picture of Tarnov, which is a small town of about 40,000 inhabitants, and 45% of them were Jewish. On the right side, it's Krakow, where my father worked after he came back from university, which was it's a beautiful town. Anyone saw Krakow? Yeah, it's a very nice town, even though the Russians almost destroyed all the water sources there, but it's still nice. So they lived in Krakow, in Tarnov. They went to high school, Hebrew high school. They both spoke fluent Hebrew. In fact, at home, when we came to Germany, when they wanted us not to understand what they're talking about, they spoke in Hebrew. Because as kids, we knew German and we knew Polish. So the only way to talk among themselves was Hebrew. And they were both members of HaShomer HaTzair. My father was one of the leaders of HaShomer HaTzair in Galicia. And my mother was he was a madricha during that period too, and went to different hachsharot. And the dream was always to go to Palestine. But they thought that you have to be educated to go to Palestine. And my father was very close with Meir Yari, who used to be the leader of HaShomer HaTzair, later on settled in Palestine. And when he was already in his 80s and had macular degeneration and did not see and was walking with a stick in the kibbutz, he was always stopping and saying, "Meir, how are you?" And in front of me, "I told you, Meir, that Palestine needs doctors, needs teachers," because the fight that my father had, which was later on titled Osterweilism, was that people need to go to university before they make Aliyah to Palestine. So the group that followed my father all went to different universities, learned agronomy, engineering, medicine, nursing, nutrition, and they were all expelled from HaShomer HaTzair for a time being. Later on, when they needed certificates to come to Palestine in the 30s, they were rehabilitated because they are good guys, they can help us. Anyway, that's sort of the backdrop. So, September 1, 1939, you all know that invasion to Poland was an experiment that Hitler had to see whether his army can really fight. His main goal was the East. He needed more territory for the Aryan race. But the Poles were a good target. He knew that they don't know how to fight, and that was the way to give courage to the German, to the Wehrmacht. So they go in, and they go to Tarnów on the 7th already of September. And my mother kind of saw it, and she said, "Oh, God help us." And that was before she knew what's going to happen, but that was kind of the aura behind it. And of course, the reason, yes, don't be sorry. Excellent question, thank you. So that's actually an interesting piece which I failed to say, and I appreciate Helen for this. Both of them wanted to study, and being in Poland Jewish, my father could not get into medical school. He went to university to learn philosophy because his grandmother wanted him to be a rabbi. But then it was interesting, but it was not really what he wanted to do. So in 1926, they have not married yet. Both went to Italy. My mother went to Florence and studied philosophy and education. In fact, Cassuto was one of her teachers. And she said that my father studied with her 1 year, but she saw that she's too much of a party girl. So he moved to Perugia, which was further in the mountains, and he graduated in 1931, medicine, cum laude. I was able to actually get his certificate from the university, and my mother's as well. And she graduated in 1929, and the first thing she did, she got on a boat to Palestine to meet her friends that already made Aliyah and sat in kibbutzim, in Genosar, and in Marchavia, in the valley of Jezreel, which is northeast of Haifa. And my father was already in love with her. And the only way you could get her back, he wrote her a letter that her parents really are not in such a good shape, they need her. And being a very good daughter, she came back. And then I think they got married in 1932 in Krakow. And my father went to the Jewish hospital and was trained as a pediatrician. And my mother opened a kindergarten actually there until my father was recruited to the military, as the Germans came in, and he was mobilized to the Eastern Front, to what is Ukraine now, place which you all heard about in the news, which was called Lvov, now it's called Lviv, and was called Lemberg, which shows you the history, depending who was running that place. And when he was in Lvov, he was a Polish officer, but he did not make a big, it was not very known that he was a Polish officer. And the Russians essentially gave him a job in a small town named Truskaviec, where he was working in a sanatorium. He was teaching them. He got very friendly with them. But he also saw the other side of them. In fact, in Lvov, when they came in, they went around with loudspeakers and called all the teachers and the doctors and the officers to come to an important message in town hall. His colleague was from the area said, in Polish there is a statement, it doesn't smell well. Let's not go. That day, the Russians brought about 5,000 people to City Hall, and as people were gathered there, trucks came from 3 directions, and they're all gunned down. And he escaped that because he decided not to go there. So that's the part of the story. Then, when he went after the Germans came in, and he went back from Truskaviec to Lvov, he was caught by the Germans. And see, that was the 3 axis that the Germans fought. And this is very similar to what, why you see the war in Ukraine. The lower part is actually where the flats are. And that's also where Napoleon actually invaded Russia through the same thing. I don't have an arrow here, it doesn't matter. Or maybe yes. Oh, here, that one. This is the central part, and that's the northern part. And essentially, he was somewhere here in that area where Lvov is. And he was thrown into a camp called Janowska Wola, which was essentially a work camp that the Germans have created for Poles, Jewish and not Jewish, to work on their hardware, essentially fixing trucks, doing things, and only later on, that was the camp. And had essentially carries. It had a stone, they were sent to work in the stone quarries and in the cemeteries. So you can imagine a pediatrician with smooth hands was going every morning to the cemetery to break stones in order to make roads. And that whole time, my sister and my mother were here in the ghetto, and they were moved from their own house, and they had to go and share an apartment with 5 other families. And my mother had a work permit, so she was going and working, quote unquote, and my grandmother was watching over them as long as she was around. And then my mother, when she saw things going from bad to worse, tried to put her with a Gentile family, and then they lost contact with her. The marketplace, which is a beautiful place, was actually where all the deportations happened. And somehow my mother kept in touch with people in the Judenrat, and they seem to have known when a deportation is going to happen. Every time there was a deportation about to happen, she was going and hiding in the Aryan part. And my father left her some information saying, if something happens, go to the Jewish hospital, the director there knows me, he'll keep you in there. And there was a deportation coming, and she went to the hospital and he said, I'm sorry, all the beds are accounted for. I don't have a place for you. So she walks out of on the Aryan side of the hospital, and she says, I have to go to one of the houses that were owned by her sisters or by my grandparents that had a janitor who was actually sympathetic. But she said, if I'll go with her, they will identify me. So she took off in Tarnov, they did not have the yellow patch. They have Wupaska, they had like a band here, a blue band. So she took that off, took her glasses off, and saw a pair of lovers, young people, and said, do me a favor, I'm very busy. Are you going in that direction? And she pointed to where the janitor was. please take my daughter to him and tell him I'll be there soon because I have some errands to run. When I asked her about it, did you know what you're doing? She said, no. If I would have known and thought about what I'm doing, I wouldn't have done it and I wouldn't be here. So everything was very instinctive, gut feeling on the moment. So that's a painting that my sister did in 1972, which is now in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, of one of those deportations. Now, there are a couple of psychologists here, and when I showed this picture to my sister, I said, what really inspired you to do this? She says, I don't know, this was like, she called it the aktia, deportation. The story behind it is amazing. You see here, it's not a very sharp picture. So imagine by this lady actually stands a child. That's actually, and the child is actually, it's my sister. And the story was that the janitor hid in the basement two ladies that were quote unquote smart enough to go into town with the address of this place where they were hiding in their purse. Plus, they did not take their Jewish sign off their hands, and they were stopped on the street. And the picture on the right corner is actually a German who came actually and pulled them out of the basement later on, and my grandmother. And my sister was standing here, and she described that she's now 85, and she still remembers that vividly. And she was kind of screaming, Grandma, Grandma. She was very attached to her. And the German looked and said, who is the mother, who is the grandmother of this beautiful child? So my mother said, she used the term in German, I was never taught to lie, and I never lied in this position either. And she pointed to her grandmother, to her mother. So the German took Eva, my sister's name was Eva, and took the grandmother and pushed both of them to my mother and said, take care of them, took the two ladies and left. And that's actually what's in that picture. So, give you the background, I'm trying to stay on time. The Germans are continuing, we're now in 43, and my mother saying, where is my husband? My grandfather on my father's side had a tailoring shop, as your grandfather, Joe. Very high-end tailor shop, which was taken by the Germans, but was taken actually by an Austrian named Julius Madrich. We'll talk about it in a minute. And one of his lieutenants was named by the name of Fritsch, which I met after the war. And he approached my uncle, Usher, who was my father's brother, and said, Mr. Osterweil, have you thought about what will happen to you if you don't leave now? Oh, it was a big surprise. You know, he was the superintendent of that shop. And then he continues and said, look, if you want to get out of here, I have a plan, and spelled it out. And the plan was costly. And my uncle came to my mother and said, you know, we have this German who looks kind of decent. Maybe he can find Munich. Munich was my father's nickname. His name was Moshe. So he introduced Fritsch, which I think is on the left here, to my mother. And my mother already was interviewing all kind of Polish underground people, mostly communists who kind of, for money, was looking for Jews. Many times were taking the money and not finding the Jews. And she said, Fritsch looks to me trustworthy. He was clean, he was very straightforward, was gentlemanlike. And he said, look, I can go, I think he's probably in Janowska. I'll go down there. It's about 150 kilometers south of Tarnów. southeast, and so it was. So the reason I'm showing the scheme of the camp here, you see the camp was here. Here, there was a lot of, you see here, piaski, which is sand dunes. So you had the camp in the front. There was a railroad going here. And the inmates were leaving with a truck, usually with very few guards, crossing the railroads and going to the Jewish cemetery to break stones. So Fritsch came to the cemetery, and my father was just recovering from typhus. He lost a lot of, he was a very heavy-set person. He weighed maybe 60 kilos at the time. And he came to him in the cemetery, and he was able to bribe the guard, who was a woman. And the woman had some sympathy for my father because she had a daughter who had some kind of viral disease, and she was vomiting, and she heard that my father is a pediatrician, so he gave her advice. Just give her a lot of fluids, give her borscht, and the kid survived, so she kind of had a soft spot for my father, and she let Fritsch talk to him. And Fritsch essentially said, tomorrow, when you cross the railroad, there'll be only few people in the back of the truck, and usually the guard sits in the front. It slows down, jump. When you jump, I'll be there, give you new clothes, and we'll get out of here. I have to add that the Germans had a policy that any inmate that escapes, 9 others pay with their life. So everyone was watching everybody's back. So he drives with this truck with his mates. There were 2 other on the truck. And that part I heard from him directly, that he repeated multiple times, come with me. And I only realized later why he insisted. He wanted to make sure that he did what he could to save them, because if they would come with him, there was a chance that they could survive. If they wouldn't, they wouldn't, because they would be killed because they were with him and did not guard him. And he jumped, and Fritsch waited for him, and then they looked at my father and said, you're senile, you're just still delusional, you don't know what you're talking about. And Fritsch met him, put clothes, and they took the train up to Tarnow. At this point, I want to tell you a little story about the camp, which sort of shook me up a little bit. Because I heard the story that every deportation to Auschwitz or Belzec, the doctor of the camp was doing his selection. And whenever my father got to the doctor, he sent him back to the barracks. And my father did not elaborate why and what. One of the nurses that joined him later on in Budapest became almost like a daughter to him. And I met her she lived almost with us and worked in his hospital and so on. And one time I kind of talked to her, that was actually in the 80s, and said, Marisha, do you know the story? How did he survive the camp? He says, you don't know the story? I said, no. He said, the camp doctor essentially kept him alive because he needed him. The story was, you see the guy here on the horse? He was a real bad guy. Every Sunday morning, his wife lived with him in the camp, and the daughter was around 8. They were essentially target shooting. And guess what were they target shooting? The target shooting kids. And the kid had some kind of encephalitis, and again, my father gave his best advice, and the kid survived, based on his advice or not. And the doctor said, he's an asset, I need him here. And he essentially, for me, it was a shock. I said, oh my God, my father essentially survived the camp because he helped this bastard daughter. And that was very hard for me. And later on, I reconciled with the fact that, he was a doctor, he would do anything to take care of anybody, but that was kind of a moral dilemma for me. The other piece here was actually the change. He was in hell. I mean, getting up in the morning, going and working 10 hours and coming back. And one of the days he comes back, you see here, administration barracks. So he goes like this, and he sees a line of kids standing with their back to a wall. And 5 or 6 Gestapo standing, SS essentially, standing with their guns drawn. And he says, "Oh my God, if God is here, that will not happen." And it did happen. And at that moment, he made a promise to himself. He says, if he survives this hell, he's going to dedicate beyond his professional life some years to take care of needy kids. And the reason I'm telling you this story, because I see it like a phoenix coming out of the fire. He was really in hell, he comes out, and that sort of led him to what he did from that part of the war and later on. Just a word about Madrich. He became actually one of the righteous of the world. He got it from Yad Vashem. He was a very fair guy. He ran those workshops, and he always hired more Jews to work there because he knew as long as they work there, they are not going to be deported. He had good relationship with SS, but he was not really a Nazi in his beliefs. And we met him later on after the war. But the person we kept most touch was actually Fritsch, which my father later on rehabilitated with a large grant from the Joint, who let him open like a guest house in Bavaria. And he came to Passover, he visited us in Israel. But one thing happened. My uncle wanted to appoint him as a righteous of the world. And my father was supposed to write the affidavit for the Supreme Court judge to approve it because he was better known, and my father refused. And I heard those arguments in my parents' bedroom. Why are you such a stubborn? Why don't you just sign the letter? He says, no, this award is for people who did it, not for money. In Fritsch, we paid him handsome, and he is a great guy, but that's not the award for him. That was another sort of dilemma. And I always ask when I talk to my son is teaching history in Pali High, so every year in May I'm giving talks there. And I'm asking students, what would you do? And interesting enough, they supported him. How would you do? Would you sign the letter? That's a good point. I think he was in quite danger, although he had a lot of layers of protection, but he took risks. He took risk. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So Fritsch essentially, after bringing my father to Tarnov, my father never got into the ghetto, stayed outside the ghetto. My mother visited him one night without bringing my sister actually to see him. So figure, 1939 he leaves, it was 1943, he hasn't seen his daughter for 4 years now. And they had a short encounter saying, tomorrow I'm going to a village, I'm going to recover for about 2 weeks, and then Fritsch and I am going to find the route down south to the Carpats into Slovakia, which was not yet fully dominated by Germans at that time. And so it was. Fritsch took him with Madrich truck to this family of farmers that, the money talks, so they did not really ask questions. My father just slept and ate and slept and ate for 2 weeks, and in fact 16 days. And then Fritsch came and went with him south, and he crossed the border with some smugglers. And before they depart, each went on his way. On a piece of newspaper, my father wrote a note to my mother saying, the labor was hard, but the baby is alive. which means you can trust Fritz, you can pay him the other half, because that part of the deal my father paid, the other part my uncle paid. And the next day, Fritz comes to my mother in the ghetto. He said, take Eva now, small bag, don't take anything, as if you're coming back. And through different doors, the ghetto was essentially blocked, different businesses were blocked, and there was not really a true wall, but he opened that, he gave a cigarette to the Ukrainian who was guarding the gate, and there was a truck, one of Madrid's trucks, drove by a German who escaped from Dachau, apparently was a communist or anti-Nazi, and my mother and my sister sat in the front, and my uncle and my two cousins and his wife and another couple who was invited for the ride because of the huge cost of this enterprise were in the it was a double-deck truck. And on the top, there were a lot of residuals of tailoring and shoes and all kind of garbage on it, so they can kind of look decent, look kosher. And they headed south. And part of the trip was essentially by foot during the night, and part of it was sleeping in farmers, with the cows, which was very hot, warm, and nice there because, the manure was pretty heating there. Or he paid the family to let them sleep in their beds until they got to the Slovakian border. And it's interesting, my sister, he's a physician too, retired now, she's a painter. And she just did, every year on our mother's anniversary, she does an art show. And the last art show was on light. And she writes in the introduction that what inspired her was actually these little flies, the fireflies that she saw on the way. And that gives her this feeling of goodness coming from the light. I thought I'll share it with you because it's sort of personal. Anyway, they cross the border and they meet my father. And now my father wants my sister to go with him because they separated the women from the men. I mean, the Slovakians were not negative. They were just wanted to make sure that nobody creates any hassle there. And my sister didn't want to go. He was a stranger for her. And she says the first time and the last time in her life that she got spanked, but my father was dead because he was frustrated. He wanted to take her. And she did not, for her, he was a stranger. They cross the border and they stay with a pharmacist there. And my uncle and his wife and the two cousins already had a car arranged to go to Budapest. And my father wanted to stay for a few days there to kind of recover after not seeing his family for 4 years. And after a few days, they got a telegram from my uncle saying that his wife is in the hospital, had some gallbladder problems, and please come and help us. So they rush with the train. They didn't have tickets, so they sat, where the machinist, puts the coal into they sat there, and my sister still for years had this coat with a little hole that came from one of the, so they get to Budapest. And this is the story where actually some people who were not recognized comes into play. This guy is Slavik. If you read lately, posthumously, he was actually recognized as the righteous of the world by Yad Vashem. He was a Pole, and he was representing the Polish regiment in exile that was sitting outside of Budapest. And the consul of Poland already left, but Slavik kept his stamp. He had his official stamp. And this guy, Komoloi, was a Jew, was a hero of World War I, introduced my father to Slavik, and Slavik issued documents that my father was a Pole by the name of Karoli Kotarba. My mother was Helen Kotarba, and my sister was Eva Kotarba. And from that point on, they had new identity in Poland, and he recommended that they stay outside of Budapest in a town called Vác. If you look on the map, it's about 20 kilometers north of Budapest. And Sławik essentially was instrumental in introducing my father to Poles. I'm not clear if he was a Pole or he was actually a Czech. He was a priest who ran like a school in Vác. And my father essentially befriended him, and they opened it and called it the Polish orphanage. And everyone in the neighborhood and the area knew, do you have a problem with your child? Send him to Kotarba. Because, everyone was welcome. And by July of 43 or 44, there were about 96 kids in that orphanage. And I knew about the orphanage, but I couldn't find any documentation. And one night I look at, internet is a fantastic trove of treasures, and I find a 2020 of a gentleman now in his 80s, Ed Herman, he lives in Florida. He was talking about him being lost on the street in Budapest. And his mother knew that he would not survive in Warsaw, so she arranged for smugglers to bring him to Budapest, and then they left him. And he was crying on the street, and a lady, interesting enough, by the name of Schweitzer, says, "What are you crying, baby?" He tells her the story, and she says, "Don't worry." She took him and brought him to Vác, to Kotarba. So he tells me the story, and he says, "It was awful. I had to sleep with another child in the same bed, and he was urinating in bed because he was traumatized, and I got pneumonia. But luckily, there was a doctor there who took care of me." So I kind of waited for a minute and said, "That was my father." He said, "Oh my God." He started sending me photographs. And after looking at the photographs, I don't know whether I have them here. Probably not. Yeah, I do. Those are photographs that I actually found in Yad Vashem. So I said, "That's interesting. I saw those photographs in Yad Vashem." He says, "Yeah, I sent them there." And the reason they did those photographs, because when the Germans came into Vác, they told them to take photographs, because they said, nobody knows how many people will survive, just let's document ours. And that was a school that 100% of our kids were actually Jewish, and they practiced Shabbat, and they practiced Passover, and they insisted eating kosher. And this priest was very collaborative. He was coming every Wednesday and doing a sermons. From the outside, it looked like a place that could be kosher, but inside it ran Jewish life. And there was another lawyer who helped my father there. He sits there actually. It's too small of a picture, this guy. And lo and behold, a few days later, my father is hauled into the police station by the Hungarians. And they want to strip him. Say, something doesn't look right here. So he gave them a riot act and started throwing names, including the name of Komoloi, who was a big official in the Horthy government. So they said to him, "Okay, you know what? We'll let you go." He showed them the International Commission of Red Cross card that he had, and they said, that's fake. He said, "Well, I'll call Komoloi, he'll verify that that's true." So they said, "Okay, leave. But in 2 weeks, we don't want any child to stay in that orphanage." So he and the other lawyer started taking those kids in bunches of 15 or 20 with a train to Budapest, which was a big town, was still already bombarded by the Russians. So there were a lot of kind of semi-abandoned houses. And he placed those kids in those houses, with the older kid being like the captain, and the younger kids were under his supervision. And my aunt, Hanka, and my father were hopping from house to house, cooking meals for them and making sure that they're okay. And about, I don't know how many houses initially there were, At the end of the war, there were 7 of those houses that he ran. So that's my father. That's his ID card from the International Commission of Red Cross. He was head actually of Section A of the International Red Cross in Budapest. And I found actually documentation to that independently. The kids, all of them survived. And they joined other kids that stayed in Budapest. And there were Hungarian kids, there were Polish kids, there was Czechoslovakian kids. And at a certain point, when the Russians came in, my father befriended a Russian colonel who happened to be a Jew and was very keen about watches. I don't know whether you know the story about Russians and the watches. You know, Russian soldiers could stop somebody on the road that has a watch. They would kill a person for a watch because it was really a commodity in Russia. There was nothing. And my father knew it from the time he was in Truskavec, so he went to pawn shops and got watches. That's why I have a fetish about watches. And he showed this colonel who was actually keen about watches, and he bartered. He gave him a watch, and the guy brought him a truck with food for the kids. At a certain point, they got really friendly, and he says to my father, I see that you really care about those children. I think that you should really get out of here before we establish, you know, the Russian-type regimen here, because it won't be good for the Jews. And those are the houses. This house, by the way, is still existing now. I saw it on Google Map, on Google Camera. It still has something else in it, but that was the house that, this one in the center, that he stayed with most of the kids, and he had like a little clinic there, took care of the kids. And at a certain point, a lot of people were coming after the war, and that was the first place they stopped because they get their first meal there. Because my aunt was a very good cook, and she had like a kitchen that always something was on the fire, and people could eat their meal. And as I said, there were 7 of those safe houses. In 2008, I'm getting a call from my brother's son in New York. His name is Tzvi Osterweil, who is an ENT doctor there. And he says, somebody called me and asked for Dr. Kotarba. Do you know, he's also my father's grandson, but he never met my father because my father was already dead when he was born. Long and behold, I said to this guy, I called him on the phone and I said, his name was Axelrod. And he says, I'm actually looking to meet somebody, Dr. Kotarba. And I said, what your interest is? He says, he saved me. And I want to talk to my synagogue about him. So I was, by coincidence, was invited as a visiting professor to Mount Sinai. And on Saturday, we met actually in the Marriott, and he came with his wife, and he told me his story. He said that he was a kid, was born actually in Poland, but his parents went to Western Czechoslovakia at that time, which, you know, they were the Sudeten. So they were thrown, because they were kind of pro-nationalist, the more pro-German threw them into a hard labor camp in Czechoslovakia, and they were able to escape. And they went down to Hungary, which they knew it's a little freer, and they went into a monastery. And in fact, he was starting to be taught how to be a priest, and his father did not go into the monastery, but was kind of in touch. And at a certain point, they started seeing the Iron Cross people coming to the monastery and looking for kids. So I said, that's not safe here. And they went down to Budapest, which was in the flats, and became, you know, part of the ghetto there. And the Germans started shooting everyone in sight, and they shot him in the eye and in the leg, and he was under a pile of corpse. And my father with his corpsmen were going after the this mayhem, looking for whoever they could find survive. And they dug him out. And they took him to one of the safe houses and nursed him to health. And he said, it was interesting about the Russians, he said he was a little older than the other kids in those houses. So the Germans started deserting when they saw the Russians coming into town, and they took off their clothes and they wanted just to blend in. And two Russians came into the safe house and saw him, and he was blue-eyed, blonde, and he was about close to 16. And they pulled a revolver to shoot him. And he says in Russian, being in Czechoslovakia, he knew some Russian. He says, "I'm Jewish, don't shoot me." So one Russian looks at the others, those Germans did not have enough bullets for this one. So that shows you the love that the Russians had for Jews. So he wanted to tell that story. And unfortunately, he died from pancreatic cancer a few years ago. But he was a chemical engineer, taught in a college, and he continued following my father's group until they got to Germany. And they said, if a certificate from United States will come earlier, visa will come earlier, we'll go to the United States. If a certificate will come to Palestine, we'll go to Palestine. And the United States won because he had a family somewhere in Pittsburgh, and they sponsored him, and they all went to the United States. I think I should leave. We have 5 minutes to go, and I can probably tell you more. Hopefully some of you, your curiosity and interest may have been piqued, and you can read the book or listen to the book as you drive. But I really would like you to challenge me. Well, we have still 5 minutes with the time allotted to my lecture, no?
Take 3 of them.
All right, so there is actually one important story that I want to share with you. This sweet guy on the left, his name is Hazak. Actually, his name today is Yosef or Joseph, and I call him brother, but he's actually my cousin. And he was in Tarnov with his father and his mother, living a very good life. His father had a shirt factory. He was one of my father's, he was the youngest brother of my father. And they all talked about Palestine, but they all, kind of lived the life of petit bourgeois in Poland. And one day, actually the date is September 2nd, 1943. His wife, his mother were taken to the Munich, to the marketplace that I showed you before. And he stands on one by his mother. His father was actually on the other side with the men. They were not taken. And his mother looked around and knew that that's a one-way street for her. So she threw a coat on him and says, "Hazak, go to daddy." So the men are on this side, the women on this side, and in the middle are the Wehrmacht with their guns pulled out, and he runs in front. Nobody paid attention to him. She got on the train, and that's for him is the day she died, but he never known anything about her. His father figured things are getting terrible, and he found a lady who is here in the middle, the one you see in the Yanka Tatsko. She was a probably lesbian communist who tried to do what she could, and she met Hazak in the tailoring shop of Madrid, and my uncle told him, "From now your name is Ostrovsky. Never go and pee with other kids around you, just pee on your own, and she'll take you and I'll join you." And she took him to Warsaw and placed him with a family there. And 2 weeks later, his father appeared there. But things really did not go very well. And the people who brought his father figured that his father probably had some means. And one Saturday told Hazak, "You're not going to visit your dad today." And Hazak said, "Look, everybody is asleep around," and he kind of yielded. He did not fight it. The following week, he goes to visit his father with the same guy who said he's a doctor. And after a few minutes, somebody else is buzzed in, and two other people show up. And it was an L-shaped room. So Hazak stayed in one part of the room, and his father with the three other people staying on the other one. And he heard a lot of commotion and arguments. And after a while, his father said, "I'm leaving." So Hazak ran to him and said, "I want to go with you." He said, "No, you stay here." And then he hears his father telling to the doctor, say, "Let me just take my watch." So the doctor says, "Where you're going, you won't need your watch." And Hazak was thrown to the other part of the room. And a minute later, he hears like a bulb and quiet. He turns the corner and he says his father falling with blood on the door, and his father is dead. So he spent the night with his father's corpse in the room, and apparently the next day they came and killed the landlord, and then took all those, the two corpses, and somehow through Yanka, I mean, she may have been connected or not, I don't know. I heard an interview with her, and she just said something went away. A cousin of my brother / cousin was identified, who was in the underground. She was a communist. And she came and took him and placed him with another family. And from when the Russians came, they put him actually in an orphanage outside of Warsaw. So now the picture is, my parents are in Budapest, he is in Warsaw, and the 209 kids and my father and everybody is cramming into the train station in Budapest. And my mother sees somebody walking, and she says, she was very myopic, and she sees somebody going in the distance, and she said, "Rachel!" And my father says, "Who are you calling?" He says, "Trust me." The lady comes and says, "What do you want?" Kind of very aggressive. She was from Israel. She was an activist that went to save kids from behind the Iron Curtain. And my mother said, "You're going to, where are you going?" He said, "East." She said, "When you go to Warsaw, a place called Potsok, there is a kid that answers the name Hazak. Bring him to me." My father looks at us. "Are you nuts? In this chaos, what will happen?" My mother said, "I believed it will happen." Moving forward, my father and the kids moved from Budapest to Bratislava, from Bratislava to Prague, and in Prague, my mother got some kind of lymphangitis, some kind of inflammation of the lymph node, whatever, I don't know what it was. And she stayed there, and a physician, actually a German, gave her sulfa to treat. And my father and the kids and my sister went again in a clandestine way to cross the border into Germany, which was occupied by the Brits and the United States. And my mother stayed behind. She said the day was January 8th, and she was very kind of sad, Snow started falling, and she's alone with this German taking care of her. And all of a sudden, she sees a kid coming out of the, kind of fog with the snow, with boots and green jacket, and that was Hazak. And he came, and the day was actually his birthday, January 8th. So he was with her a few hours only, and she arranged for those activists from Palestine to take him to join my father. It was in a DP camp already, in the German occupied site called Bamberg. And that's the story of a kid, how he came. And when I asked him, how did you come? He says, we just walked. Two men came to me and says, I'll take you to your daughter, to your aunt. And they just walked. And each crossing, they were told, you're Greek kids, you're from Greece. Every time they call your name, you say Ken. Ken in Hebrew is yes. So they won't know from Adam what you're saying. Just go. So they crossed the border, from Poland to Hungary to Czechoslovakia. I don't know what, I think it's crossed Austria and then Czechoslovakia. So that's sort of the tip of the iceberg.
Dan, thank you very much. So fascinating, so just amazing stories. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.